Welcome to the Science of Kindness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Culver, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us today. We share real stories and give you tips, tricks, and strategies to fit kindness into your life. Enjoy and know that you are a bright light in this world. Welcome back to the Science of Kindness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Culver. Before we jump into today's episode where we're talking about you're not lazy, you're just avoiding something, and stay with me. That may make you feel a certain way when I talk about the topic, but stay with me because as always, kindness is the through line. But before we dive into that topic, if you've not done so, make sure you're following. You like, you share, you interact, and you're subscribed to our channel so that you're getting the latest and greatest updates around the Science of Kindness podcast because we're always putting out great content that's not only applicable for your workspace, but also your personal life. So I'm grateful that you've joined us and made the choice to be here today. I love talking kindness. As a kindness advocate and kindness researcher, it clearly is my thing. And I think sometimes, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, we have forgotten our understanding of kindness because it comes from that kindergarten lens. And so today, as I mentioned, I'm going to say something that may feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that's never my intent, but you are not lazy, friend. You are avoiding something. And before you push back and you say, Dr. Culver, that's not true. That's not me. Chris, that's not it. I'm not saying that you need to be more disciplined, right? And I don't even want you to tell yourself, I just need to get my stuff together. There's so many of us who operate in this should mindset, right? I should do this. I should do that. I should do these things. And I was giving this understanding to a corporate retreat the other day. One of the ladies raised her hand and she said, Dr. Culver, we can't should on ourselves. And I started laughing and I said, tell me again what you just said. And she said, you cannot should on yourself. And we were talking about the word should specifically because the research is suggesting that using the word should sends the same threat response to your brain as a physical pain response. Your brain can't discern between is this physical danger or am I telling myself something, right? So when you use the word should, you're giving yourself the pressure, the demands to meet these unrealistic or unobtainable goals. So I want you to sit with me for just a second. Because what if the issue was never effort? What if it was never motivation? But what if the issue is that your brain is trying to protect you from something? I was talking to Dr. Frederick Buskey in North Carolina a couple weeks ago, and he was sharing that value divided by effort equals motivation. And so many of us believe we have a motivation problem. But the reality is, what if our brain is protecting us from something? Think about something that you've been putting off for a moment. Maybe it's a conversation you haven't had with someone. Maybe you have delayed a decision that you need to make. Perhaps you haven't set a boundary that needs to be set with a family member, a colleague, or a loved one. Maybe there's a phone call that you haven't returned. Or for my own personal experience, there's text messages that I have not responded to, right? And not because of any other reason besides of time. I say that, right? But maybe in this episode, by the end, I'm going to have a different understanding of why I've delayed those text messages. But the reality is, when we put these things off, we think we're protecting ourselves. But we're not. We're actually sending threat response to our brain because we're holding all these demands and the pressure to align appropriately. We live in a culture that labels everything as laziness. You didn't do something? Guess what? You're lazy. You're tired? Lazy. Overwhelmed? Lazy. But here's the truth. Laziness is hardly ever the problem. The problem is usually avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of conflict, avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of failure, avoidance of rejection. And when we don't understand that, we are attacking ourselves instead of understanding ourselves. And we protect ourselves to keep ourselves safe. I mentioned this in an earlier episode where we worked in tribes and groups of people around hunters and gatherers, right? Especially that stage of civilization in our world. Well, now in today's world, we are less connected than ever before, and we try to control other people, their response, their intentions, their actions, their alignment. And the reality is we can only control ourselves. So when we try to control the outcome, we think we're protecting ourselves, but really we're avoiding something. And so when we don't understand that laziness is not the problem, but avoidance is, then we end up attacking ourselves rather than understanding ourselves. And friends, I've done this too, right? I worked in an organization where I was an executive team member, and there was my supervisor hired one of her friends. And there were really unclear expectations. There were inconsistent accountability measures for myself and other team members parallel to this one friend. And I share this because there was a moment in which a group meeting, got pretty escalated, and I felt as if that individual personally attacked me with their language, with their body language, with their energy, with their tone of voice. And what I realized is that nobody was stepping up to say anything, right? And so in my mind, I started to shame spiral. I started to doubt things. I started to question my belief, my worthiness, my value. And what I realized was I needed to address the situation. But just like any good human, I decided to prolong that conversation because I thought if I avoided that conversation, it would make everything easier. But what happened was every day that I avoided that conversation, every day I went and approached to say, hey, I felt this way based on this, right? I was walking on eggshells. And what happened was it festered within our team, within our relationship, and it impacted how we collaborated, how we talked, how we cross-team organized, how we worked across teams to create outcomes for the purpose of the business. And so there really was never an issue outside of the fact that I should have addressed it in the moment. But what had happened was I had created spirals of stories in my mind as to why I shouldn't confront this individual, why I should not have this hard conversation, why I should not do these things, right? And the reality is I thought I was controlling the outcome. I was creating more safety. I was creating more awareness for myself. But the reality was I was creating more stress, more anxiety, and more pressure, all because I was avoiding the hard conversation. And I share this vulnerably with you because how many of us have done the same thing? How many of us have avoided the conversation? How many of us have avoided the response that's needed, right? And I think, again, that's where we confuse our definition of kindness and niceness that we've talked about before. And we're going to go a little bit deeper in the next episode, but today we're talking about that avoidance piece. Because here's what's actually happening in our brain when we're avoiding things. As I mentioned, our brain is wired for safety. We're not wired for productivity. We're not wired for performance. We're wired for safety, right? Am I safe here? Do I belong here? Am I seen here? Am I valued here? Am I respected here? And those questions may seem cliche, but if the answer is no, then we don't feel safe. And if we're not psychologically safe, then we can't take risks, right? So if we're telling ourselves that if we don't understand that our brain is wired for safety, so when something feels uncertain or emotionally risky or even socially uncomfortable, our brain flags that as a threat, just like I was sharing with my experience with my former colleague. And when that happens, guess what? Cortisol increases. And let me pause here for a second. I want to be really clear. We have a baseline level of cortisol. But when we are stressed out, we're in that space of uncertainty, we're spiraling in shame or fear or worry, then we're pumping more cortisol into our body. And that's terrible. We're not supposed to have that increased level of cortisol. Our body is not made for that. And I've shared this statistic again, but I want to make sure I highlight it. 70% of Americans are living in a chronic state of stress. So when we're in that stress mode, we're not only pumping cortisol into our body, but we're also shifting into protection mode, right? That fight or flight response, protecting ourselves to ensure that we're safe. And our brain is saying not now. So I want to be clear. Your brain is helping you protect yourself. It's not laziness. It's total biology. It's how we are wired. You are not avoiding things. You're not avoiding the tasks or the hard moments because you don't care. You're avoiding them because something about that situation, that conversation, that phone call, that text message, something about that does not feel safe to you. And so you're avoiding it. And some of you listening may say, I'm not avoiding anything. I'm doing my best. I'm trying to manage the time I got. And friend, I hear you, right? I hear you. And I appreciate that vulnerability and that perspective. But when we look at different scenarios deeper and closer, sometimes we're able to discern, you know what? I am avoiding something. So let's look at some different scenarios. The first scenario I want to look at is a work scenario. So let's say at work, right, your respective line of work, and this could be at home too. It doesn't have to be exactly at a corporate job or owning a business. It could be in any respective space that you are putting off a task, right? Let's say you're putting off a task not because it's hard, but because you're afraid it won't be good enough. You're putting off that task because you're unsure of how it will be received. You're putting off a task because you don't want to be judged. And friend, I can empathize and connect with all of those statements. There are many times where I've put things off because it's not going to be perfect. And I remember in my childhood when things were perfect, right, I was praised. And it stems by that perfectionism characteristic trait that we all carry. Like some of us carry that perfectionism trait because it stems back to a time as a childhood that we have to believe that we're perfect in order to get recognition. But sometimes when it's not perfect, it's just as great. And we have to be mindful of that. When we tell ourselves, I'll do this later, right? I'm going to put this off until I do this. I'm going to put this off until I do this. When we do those things, we say, I'll do it later. We're being nice to ourselves. But when we tell ourselves, I'm afraid of how this will land, that's being kind because we're being honest. So many of us are fearful of the discomfort of being honest, right? But when we are honest, we're allowed to be kind to ourselves and for other people. The other thing I would share is we're often kinder to other people, but not as kind to ourselves. So we have to ask ourselves, what's true and what's not true about what we're telling ourselves, right? Am I scared or am I avoiding something because I'm scared? Am I afraid because it's not going to be perfect? Am I scared because it's not going to be this? There's no right or wrong answer, but the reality is we have to identify what it is so that we can move forward. Some people have grand ideas in their minds, but they're so fearful to step forward because the idea of starting is so overwhelming. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is it overwhelming because it's too daunting, or is it overwhelming because I'm scared and afraid of how it's going to go? Sometimes the biggest failures that we have are lining us up for our greatest comeback. But we don't see that in the moment, especially when we're putting off tasks that make us scared because of how it will be received or how it will be processed. Let's shift from a task perspective and let's talk about a relationship for a second. Let's say you're avoiding a conversation with a loved one, with a colleague, with a friend. And it's not because you don't want conflict, and it's not because you don't want to hurt feelings, and it's not because you don't want to be misunderstood, right? But when we do those things, we're telling ourselves, it's not worth it. I'm going to be nice. But the reality is when we choose kindness, we tell ourselves, this matters enough to talk about. And that really is where honesty comes in. In those moments with my former colleague where there was unmet expectations, where there were inconsistent accountability measures, where there were one set of rules for some people and another set of rules for somebody else, there was a lack of clarity about what was the expectation. There was a lack of clarity of leadership. There's a lack of clarity of belonging. There's a lack of clarity of so many things. And when we're ambiguous in that way, when we lack clarity, it sends a threat to our brain as when we're in physical danger. That's why when we are clear, we're kind, right? We're kind, but we're clear. We are communicating kindness to somebody else. And oftentimes, kindness is uncomfortable. Right? It's having to have those hard conversations, having to stand up for what's right. It's having to work in that moment of uncomfortability because that's what kindness is about, because this moment matters enough to talk about it. That conversation you've been avoiding, is it because you're scared of how it's going to be received? And can it be reframed to say this matters enough that we need to talk about it, no matter what it may be? And I think the hardest part we have to remember is, when we're delivering honest feedback, we're giving honest conversations, and we don't project, right? We're not saying you did this, you did this. We're talking in I statements. I felt this when this happened. I felt this when this happened, right? If someone doesn't hear you, that's not necessarily on you. Sometimes people are defensive. Some people are dismissive. Sometimes almost push the feedback aside because they don't want to hear it. That's okay. The reality is if you were kind, you were honest, and you were rooted in the truth, then the conversation matters. Because that type of kindness is a shift from our kindergarten kindness, right? To this adult level kindness that's so important. And as I've talked about many times before on the podcast and previous episodes, it's easy. It is so easy to be kind to other people, to have grace, to have understanding, to have compassion, to have empathy, even sympathy with other people. But we are hardest on ourselves. And I'll say it again, as I've said in previous episodes, if you would never say it to a friend, please don't say it to yourself, right? Be kind to your mind. Let's talk about a scenario with yourself specifically that talks about you're stuck, right? You're stuck in a job. You're stuck in a relationship. You're stuck in a situation. You're stuck somewhere, right? And you might be stuck because you're exhausted, you're overwhelmed, and you're disconnected. And so many of us are wired to say, I just need to push through. I need to keep going. I need to figure this out. But self-kindness says, I need something different. I need to figure this out from a different perspective. We can't pour from an empty cup. I'll be vulnerable that yesterday it was Monday. I had my alarm go off and I was super excited. And I got to the computer and I was getting ready to work and I had all this pain in my shoulders. I felt physically and mentally exhausted. I was dragging, and simple tasks that usually would take a couple minutes were taking much longer. And I was reflecting and I realized for 2 weeks straight, I had been on the road, I'd been traveling, I'd been with family, I'd been working, I'd been doing all these things and not really had any downtime. And we can't pour from an empty cup. And so I think my body was telling me, you're exhausted, you're overwhelmed, you're putting all this pressure on yourself, you've got to stop. I need something different, right? Just like I was sharing with you. And what that something different was not to blow up my entire life, right? Not move out of my house and get a new car and all these crazy things for dopamine hits. I needed something different in that day and that moment. So for me, I moved to the couch and I took a little rest. I prioritized self-care. I prioritized downtime so that I could breathe, I could recenter, I could regroup. But in a world in which we are moving so fast, we oftentimes put ourselves last and then think we don't need to change anything. We're doing our best because we've been conditioned to burn both ends of the candlestick at the exact same time. So friend, I want to pause here for a second, and I want you to follow me along with this activity. No matter if you're driving, you're sitting in a space, you're listening on a run, whatever it can be, you can do this with us in this respective space. So I want you to take one breath in with me through your nose, one long exhale through your mouth, and again. Great. Did you notice the tension in your body? So many of us are carrying things that we don't realize. But in that breathing activity, we're able to recenter ourselves so quickly to allow a little bit of room in our brain to process, to ask ourselves these two questions. What am I avoiding in my life right now? And we talked about some different scenarios with work, with relationships, but heck, even with ourselves. So what are we avoiding in our lives right now? And then what feels uncomfortable about it? Here's the trap. We tell ourselves that we need to be more disciplined, but discipline does not ever solve avoidance. When we understand, that's what changes everything. Because when you don't name what's actually underneath the feeling or the emotion, then you keep procrastinating, you keep overthinking, you keep avoiding, not because you're lazy, but because you're protecting yourself. And this is where the true kindness comes in. Not it's okay, don't worry about it, it's gonna be fine tomorrow, get over it. Real kindness, the kind that says, let's tell the truth. So what are you actually afraid of? Are you afraid of success? Are you afraid of failure? Are you afraid of the conversation? Are you afraid of making the wrong move? What is it that you're afraid of, and what is it that you're avoiding? And once you identify that, then I ask you to do this. What is one small step I can take anyway? Because oftentimes our conflict comes from our interpretation of events or stories that we've told in our minds or things that have happened in our experiences to make ourselves feel safe. And I want to be clear, kindness is not toxic positivity, and kindness does not eliminate fear, but kindness allows you to move forward with understanding for yourself, with your brain and the world around you. I'll share that I was putting off a really difficult conversation recently. I was talking with someone who was planning an event, and I was really struggling with the direction that they were moving with the event. I was really struggling with the individuals that were going to be aligned to this event. And it wasn't anybody in particular, it's just the demeanor in which it was being communicated, the way in which we were being addressed, if you will, right? And I noticed myself being a recluse and pulling back almost from the conversation, being less involved, offering less opinions, less insight, less perspective. And what I realized is I was creating a lot of stories in my mind. I was telling myself that things were not true. The truth were in the messages and the emails that I was receiving. But I was interpreting tone of voice, language, punctuation, all from that space to tell myself what really wasn't true. When we do that, we're putting more fear into our body, right? More fear. But when I came to the realization of, this is not true, Chris. You're not being honest. This is not true. You're telling yourself things. It allowed me to come to a center state and say, okay, what is the next step that I can do about this? And the next step was to go to the individual and say, hey, I feel this. My perspective is this, right? Again, not shaming, not projecting out onto somebody else, but owning your feelings, your thoughts, your opinions, what's going on with you. And when you do that, you move from that fear-based understanding to the truth through that one small step. And friend, I'm not saying this is easy. This is like going to the gym and making these intentional choices every single day. Our world is moving so fast. We are processing so much information at a time that sometimes it's hard to pause. But I challenge you, in that moment, ask yourself, what am I actually afraid of? And what's one small step that I can take anyway? And when you're stuck, when you're in that moment of stuckness, like I was with that correspondence of the event, ask yourself, what am I avoiding? What feels unsafe about this? And what is one honest step forward, right? What am I avoiding? What feels unsafe? And what's one step forward? And I unpacked in that experience. And I think what I had to remind myself, and I tell you this vulnerably, you don't need motivation. You have it. You're here. You're listening. You're trying to be that 1% better today than you were yesterday, 1% better tomorrow than you were today. What you need, friend, is clarity. And that's what we're working through today. And what you also need, friend, is courage for yourself and for other people. So if you've been calling yourself lazy, if you've been frustrated with yourself, if you've been hard on yourself, if you've been beating yourself up, friend, you are not broken. You're responding to the demands of your life. And at the moment you shift from judgment to understanding, everything changes. This has never been about doing more, right? It's not putting more demands on yourself and expecting the pressure to motivate you. This is all about seeing things clearly and then choosing differently. You are learning, you are growing, you are being kind to your mind, right? It's a process that you work through, and you're never going to be perfect. We're not perfect individuals. But when we have a mindset of being better than we were, then we're honest. And when we choose honesty, we operate with clarity and courage. And friend, remember, in those moments of darkness, in those moments of confusion and chaos, if you can't find the light, then you're there to be the light. And oftentimes the light we're looking for is the one that we carry on the inside. I hope this provided a more understanding of avoidance and kindness and the way it all works together. And I appreciate you being in the space today. It's always my deepest honor to share vulnerable stories and experiences to help connect with you. If someone else might resonate from this message, please share this podcast with them. If this made sense with you, subscribe, like, comment, and as always, follow along. We're coming back with more episodes in the near future. And until the next episode, friend, I love ya. And I'm always rooting for you. I'll see you in the next episode.
The Science of Kindness podcast is hosted by Dr. Chris Culver. Our executive producer is Jake Doberens. This podcast was created in conjunction with Theophany Media.